Dear ladies and gentlemen, I would like to warmly welcome you all to our today's webinar about assurance schemes in due diligence and how to make smart choices about that as a company. My name is Ursula Kopp. I'm part of the team of the Institute for Managing Sustainability at the Vienna University of Economics and Business, and I'm your facilitator for today. This is our fifth webinar, and as always, it will be recorded and made available afterwards, as well as the slides. We're looking forward to inputs of 4 speakers with very different backgrounds of 8 to 10 minutes each. Let me now welcome Jose Diemel, Senior Advisor for Responsible Sourcing at Levin Sources, and she will look at what voluntary schemes can and cannot do. Iris Rauter is a Senior Associate at KPMG Austria. She will talk about the performance of such schemes as well as the gaps. Boukje Thues from the Netherlands is Head of Policy Influencing at Solidaridad Europe. She will take a sector view at small-scale producers. And Michael Congdon, Sustainability Specialist at Entega, a national energy provider in Germany. And he will focus on due diligence in the energy transition. Thank you very much for your time and for joining this webinar. Let's start with Jose Diemel from Levin Sources. She has been advising companies in the automotive, in the battery, and in the energy sector on responsible mineral sourcing.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Angelo, Ursula, for the kind introduction. So, as part of our responsible sourcing work at Levin Sources, we help companies to navigate the complex landscapes of mandatory due diligence regulation, but also the landscape of voluntary sustainability schemes. And so the topic of today fits very well into the work that we've been doing over the past 15 years. With the core question being, what is an appropriate role for voluntary standards and assurance schemes in human rights and environmental due diligence? So when you ask companies how they manage risk in their supply chains, many businesses will respond that they use voluntary sustainability standards. And that makes perfect sense because they can facilitate performing due diligence in various ways. At the same time, civil society organizations and public authorities, such as the German Federal Office for Export Control, BAFA, have drawn attention to the risk that companies often rely too extensively on schemes to fulfill their due diligence responsibility. They also highlight that there are significant weaknesses and limitations associated with some of those standards and assurance schemes. So as a company, when you decide to use a voluntary standard as part of your due diligence efforts, it's important to understand what a voluntary standard can and cannot do as part of your due diligence process to avoid that you over-rely on them. Secondly, it's important to acknowledge that those schemes and standards have certain weaknesses and strengths. And then lastly, it's important that you ask smart questions in your selection of a voluntary standard and to ensure that you put additional measures in place to compensate for any of the weaknesses and limitations that you have identified. So then let's have a look at why over-reliance on voluntary standards in due diligence efforts can be problematic. So the main issue here is that due diligence is not the same as the services that voluntary sustainability standards provide. So on the one hand, we've got due diligence that is a continuous and proactive process which is performed by a business. This is very important, through which it identifies, it mitigates and prevents and accounts for adverse human rights impacts that are associated with either its own operations or its supply chain relationships. So it's a process that requires direct engagement with its suppliers and other stakeholders and collaboration with those groups. On the other hand, we've got voluntary standards that set non-mandatory requirements on the same set of ESG risks within mineral supply chains, and they provide an assurance process, usually through audits, that are designed to verify an individual company's practices against its standards. So at first sight, there are definitely a lot of synergies between the two, but they are not the same. So first of all, they're not the same because enterprises must retain their own responsibility to do human rights and environmental due diligence. That responsibility cannot be outsourced to suppliers, to third-party service providers such as lab and sources. Neither can they be outsourced to voluntary sustainability schemes. So when you subscribe to a voluntary standard, that does not free you as a business from your responsibility to perform due diligence yourself. Secondly, voluntary schemes can certainly support due diligence, but it's important to realize that they cannot substitute it. So when we look at the OECD six-step framework for performing due diligence, as part of step one, voluntary standards can inform the setting of a company's own public commitments to human rights, for example, of environmental stewardship. At the same time, a company still needs to build in-house capacity to follow up on those commitments, to set up a team, to allocate adequate resources, and so on. When we look at risk assessments, audit reports, often provided by voluntary standards and schemes, can definitely provide key insights into those the risks that are associated with the supply chain. But they should be treated as one source of information, as a snapshot in time that should be complemented by, for example, civil society reporting, media coverage of certain incidents. And businesses still bear the responsibility to understand the risks in their entire supply chain themselves. Then when we talk about risk mitigation and prevention, the CAPs, the corrective action plans, often developed by voluntary standard audit teams and the auditee, can be very helpful for a downstream company to understand the measures that have been taken to address risks. But at the same time, it does not disregard this business responsibility to engage with the auditee and other suppliers, to collaborate with them, to support them where needed, and to use, when necessary, its commercial and other forms of leverage to enhance improved practices on the ground. So therefore, voluntary standards should be seen as a tool to use, but not the entire toolbox to perform due diligence. So aside from the risks of over-reliance and outsourcing of due diligence, as we just discussed, various assessments done by civil society organizations such as German Watch lead the charge. And also the diligence program itself has done an analysis of 20 schemes, and they all highlight that there are existing weaknesses in some of those standards requirements, but also in the way that they are set up and their assurance schemes. So these relate to things as governance structures and their credibility, when they are run in a multi-stakeholder governance setup, the transparency that they uphold in their audit reporting, the effectiveness of their grievance mechanism, and the robustness of their assurance processes and controls put in place. Some of those weaknesses also relate to the fitness of those standards to enhance improved outcomes for affected people. So are right holders engaged, for example, throughout assurance processes? Is the risk scope adequate, and does it include historical and legacy issues? Is it aligned with international normative frameworks such as the OECD M&E guidelines and the UNGPs? And then lastly, the competitive and commercial nature of audit and the auditing market often leads to a limited time for auditing teams to be in the field. And so these weaknesses need to be taken into consideration. when choosing and using a voluntary scheme. I'll not go further into the details here because Iris, who will be presenting after me, will provide you with an overview of the findings of our diligence assessment of 20 schemes. What I do want to share with you here is an overview of some of the questions that you can ask yourself when you choose and when you use a sustainability scheme, and how to do that smartly. So some I've already touched upon in connection to the earlier slide. So in general, it's important to understand how transparent this scheme reports on its audit findings, for example, whether there are controls in place to ensure that the audit teams on the ground have experience with human rights. And then some of the questions are connected to the 6 due diligence steps as put forward by the OECD RBC guidance. So these relate to alignment with the UNGPs, for example, an adequate risk scope, whether corrective action plans are addressing root causes, whether the perspectives of affected people and right holders are being represented in the scheme, and so on. So please have a look at the questions that we lay out for you here to get a first sense of what you could do to make sure that you use those schemes in a smart way. Then once you have identified certain challenges or potentially weaknesses in the schemes that you'd like to use, what can you do? Well, we would say vote with your feet as a first step. So make sure that you only use schemes that you think are worthwhile using. When you decide to use a voluntary standard, be cognizant of the limitations of the scheme and use your leverage to interact with the scheme and to proactively discuss the avenues that you see for continuous improvement. And lastly, to put complementary measures in place to address any of the identified gaps. So thank you very much for your attendance and being with us today. I've seen some great questions passed in the chat. In case you'd like to know more about smart use of voluntary standards, please feel free to reach out to us directly and be happy to provide you with more information about the work we do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, José. Our next speaker is Iris Rauter. Amongst others, she focuses on the role of rights holders within due diligence assurance schemes. Iris, the floor is yours.
All right, so I would like to present you an overview of the overall performance as well as the gaps that we have identified while evaluating RED assurance schemes. First, I would like to start to give you an overview about the assessment approach we took. So we focused in our evaluation on the incorporation of the perspective of affected right holders within the assurance schemes. And therefore, we analyzed 20 voluntary sustainability standards and tried to summarize our findings across the 20 standards rather than provide a detailed gap analysis of the individual schemes. This assessment is already available, so if you'd like to look into further details, you can access this assessment on the Diligence website. So for the assessment, we identified 3 groups of indicators: the governance structures and transparency, right holder engagement in due diligence requirements, as well as assurance and post-assurance processes. For the governance structures and transparency, we had a closer look at how equally multi-stakeholders are represented in the governance and the governance bodies. For example, how equal their representation as well as their voting rights are. Further, we looked at the transparency in assurance reporting, so how the results of the audit reports are presented and shared. And we had a closer look at the grievance mechanisms, so how right holders are, for example, able to raise concerns about the assurance schemes. Our observation on the equal multi-stakeholder governance has been that even though that during the development of the standards, there has been a broad inclusion of different stakeholder perspectives, when it comes to the equal representation as well as the decision-making power of the right holders, there have been only a few of the standards who considered this. So less than half of the schemes included an equal representation of the right holders and their representatives, and also half of the schemes did not reflect the governance structures where right holders remain equal decision powers with the industry. For the transparency, one interesting finding has been that even though overall most of the schemes required disclosure of the substantial details as part of their public audit reports, when we had a closer look at the samples of different assurance schemes that were provided online, we found that there's only one scheme that provides a full audit report, and the others rather are providing high-level summary reports. And there's also that the level of the details varies between them. For example, when it comes to the presentation of conformances and non-conformances, or also how the corrective action plans are described in detail, and the methodologies that were used, for example, for the sampling processes. Further, the audits reports were not often proactively shared with the right holders that were engaged with the process, but rather that the audit reports are posted on the website only. When it comes to effective grievance mechanism, we found that almost all assurance schemes have a grievance mechanism in place, and they also require the companies to apply a grievance mechanism for themselves. However, only 4 out of these 20 schemes we analyzed consistently referenced the full set of the UNGP effectiveness criteria and also operationalized them. So for some of the criteria, such as accessibility, we found that they were less represented, meaning that in the case of accessibility, how the right holders can access the grievance mechanism in a way that it's, for example, only provided online. So what can the right holders do if they don't have access to the internet? And also if there are multi-languages available for the right holders to access and understand the grievance mechanism. For our next group of assessment indicators, we had a closer look at the right holder engagement in the due diligence requirements. For example, when it comes to the engagement during the risk identification, the mitigation measures, or also the performance monitoring and during remedy. And here we found that most of the schemes did require or are requiring the right holders to be consulted during the risk assessment and also during the development of the mitigation measures. However, when it comes to performance monitoring and remedy, the right holder engagement was less present. And these requirements are also, for example, not consistently applied across different topics and also or different risk types. So, for example, risks such as deforestation or risk in connection with wastewater management were more often addressed than risk in connection with, for example, human rights. And further, we found that not all right holder groups were consistently inclusive within the engagement. And in some instances, the inclusion of the right holders was represented in the non-binding terms rather than an actual requirement for inclusion. Now for our last group of indicators, we tried to analyze the engagement of right holders during the assurance and post-assurance process. Here, for example, we had a closer look at how the right holders are represented during the audit, as well as the correction active planning, as well as how the right holders are selected, like how is the methodology behind the sample sizes, and also when it comes to the mapping of the right holders, like that they are equally represented during the audit and CAP processes. And we also had a closer look at whether there is a meaningful and timely and safe engagement with these right holders. So here, for the right holder roles in the assurance process, we found that just over a quarter of these schemes explicitly requires that right holders are engaged with during the audit, as well as the correction active planning. And this is also reflected when we look at the clear requirements that the schemes set. For example, for an adequate sample size for the right holder engagements, only 6 out of 20 set clear requirements. How the sample size has to be set up, what's the methodology behind them, and also when it comes to an equal representation during the selection of right holders. And also when it comes to the independently identification and selection of these right holders. So we found that some of the schemes even allow the auditee to provide a list of the right holders the auditor should be engaging with, rather than that the auditor independently has to select the types and the group of right holders they want to engage with. And finally, for the meaningful and timely, safe right holder engagement, we found that unfortunately most of the right holders still treat the engagement as a one-way kind of information gathering than a two-way exchange where they meaningful engage with the right holder in preparing them for the audit, providing them information beforehand, also like consider a timely outreach and their availability, that they, for example, provide them information how they access the grievance mechanism, and also, and as I mentioned at the beginning, that they share the results with them directly and not just posting them online. And finally, only 7 out of the 20 schemes requires the auditor to provide right holders with a comfortable and accessible and also safe location where they feel free to talk openly, which, for example, can be out of the site plan where they have an easy way to get there, and as I mentioned, feel free to talk openly. All right, so thank you. This has been the overview of our findings. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the assessment is already available on the website. So if you want to have a closer look at our findings, feel free to check the website. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Iris. Bauke Theus, she will provide a very experienced civil society perspective focusing on the ASM minors.
Yes, thank you. My name is Bauke Theus. I work for Solidaridad. We are an international civil society organization active in over 50 countries worldwide. Our work focuses mostly on agricultural commodities like coffee, palm oil, cocoa, tea, etc. We also have a program on gold. And across all these programs, our focus is on small-scale producers. So for our minerals program for gold, that is artisanal and small-scale miners. For our agricultural programs, those are the smallholder farmers. The majority of my colleagues are based in the Global South, where we work directly with the small-scale producers. So today I will also be sharing from that perspective. Basically, what do assurance schemes bring for these producers? And I will speak a bit about artisanal small-scale mining, but I will also share some experience from the cocoa sector, where certification has been around for much longer. Before diving into that content, I just wanted to show this slide with the difference between the what, the how, and the system. Often these three terms, standard, certification, and assurance scheme, are used interchangeably. I might also do that in this presentation, but for the record, these are actually different things. Now, if we look at the assurance landscape the latest count that I could find is that there were approximately 158 mining-related sustainability standards. And the ISO working group concluded that actually there is no need for a new upstream or downstream standard in the minerals and metals sector. Obviously, there is a growing call for greater integration and harmonization and also mutual recognition of these different schemes. Having said that, let's dive into the ASM Gold sector. Artisanal and small-scale mining, ASM, is a huge sector in the global south. The estimation is that about 25 million artisanal and small-scale miners mine for gold. They are jointly producing about 20% of the global volume of newly mined gold. There are also ASM miners, obviously, for other metals, and especially for energy transition minerals. The number of ASM miners is growing a lot. About half of the ASM miners is estimated to work in gold. Now, there are two certifications for ASM mining. That is fair trade and fair mined, both for gold. And they have been developed to promote responsible gold production by improving environmental protection as well as labor conditions, thereby supporting local communities. If we look specifically at ASM production, so excluding the massive industrial mines, which we call LSM, large-scale mining, the certification for ASM is less than 1%. So even though fair trade and fair mined standards and certification were specifically designed for ASM miners, many of them operate outside these systems. And the main reason for that is that ASM mining often happens in an informal or sometimes even illegal economy. So that means, that means that certification is actually out of reach. Because to get certified, a mining cooperative must first be legal. And in many countries where we also work, like Ghana, Peru, Colombia, around 80% approximately of ASM miners are operating in the informal sector. They don't own the necessary certificates, licenses, land titles, etc. So they cannot apply for any certification. The second big barrier is, I called it here, the mercury barrier. Both certifications have strict requirements for reducing or managing mercury. However, for many miners, mercury is the only cheap way and affordable way to extract gold, and they lack the capital to buy the necessary equipment to replace mercury. This is definitely possible, but it requires investment. So this is really something that they typically don't have. And then the third barrier has to do with the small volumes of gold, making it expensive. Now, if you have not heard about the craft code, I would encourage you to look that up. You could say that the fair trade and fair mined standard is the gold standard in ASM. And very difficult to achieve for many ASM miners. That is the reason why an alternative was developed. The craft code is like a stepping stone. It's an entry-level standard. It doesn't promise a premium, a mining premium, and there's no consumer label for the gold. But it's focused on step-by-step improvements rather than first meeting a very high bar, which leads to this low uptake in the industry. Now, having said that about gold, I would like to make a little sidestep to look at the cocoa sector. Because the cocoa sector actually has decades of experience with implementing assurance schemes. Today, approximately close to half of all the global cocoa production is grown under some sort of certification label or an own company brand sustainability label. Despite all these certifications and the big uptake in the cocoa and chocolate sector, major problems persist in the cocoa sector, including deforestation, a lack of a living income, child labor, and other challenges. And actually, what we are seeing in the cocoa sector is that the relevance of certification standards and assurance schemes has actually been declining. Many companies actually know and also publicly communicate in their annual reports that their cocoa comes from farmers that struggle to make ends meet, that earn significantly below living income levels, and have also other challenges. So, but despite this knowledge, more and more companies actually claim that their products are sustainable or sustainable produced, sourced, etc. When criticized for doing this, the reply is often that the cocoa is certified by standard setting organizations, by third parties. There's an interesting development here in the Netherlands. In the summer of this year, the Dutch Consumer Authority, ACM, they published a report stating that there are no sectors making as many vague or misleading sustainability claims as the cocoa and the coffee sector. And they have subsequently announced that they will increase their scrutiny of the sustainability claims made in the cocoa and the coffee sector. It's going to be very interesting to see how the industry will respond to this, because being able to communicate with a certificate or a label on chocolate bars, on packaging, that has been a major driver for companies to adopt assurance schemes. Now, you have heard me say a couple of critical things about assurance schemes in cocoa. So you might be wondering, are there no benefits to assurance schemes and certification in cocoa then at all? No, there are several ways in which certification has played an important role to make the cocoa value chain more transparent, for example. It is, at this moment, actually, certification is one of the few ways by which higher prices and premiums can potentially be delivered to farmers. This has been very challenging because the government set the price. So this is an income increasing measure. It also helped to offer support to farmer organizations through financing and through enabling the formation of cooperatives, thereby improving the bargaining position of cocoa farmers versus their large multinational buyers. It is also the backbone to provide many other necessary interventions, such as child labor monitoring and remediation systems or village savings and loan associations. There's an important role of cooperatives in that, and certification requires the formation of cooperatives. So we definitely see also benefits. But the results are also mixed, partially as well because a lot of the certified cocoa cannot be sold as certified, and it enters the market as a regular cocoa, so without any premiums. This means that the farmers, the cooperatives have done all the investments, but they can't sell as certified cocoa because there is insufficient demand. The supply exceeds the demand, basically. Now, having said all that, I want to refer back quickly and briefly to the previous diligence webinar number 4, where we heard from researchers, also from Vienna University, who were basically questioning the impact of compliance-based approaches. So the message here, I copied this slide from the previous webinar, was that the effect of these compliance-based approaches, including assurance schemes, the impact on rights holders is relatively small, or sometimes not there. So let's also recognize the need to move beyond compliance-based approaches to more risk-based due diligence. So the OECD due diligence guidance gives a very comprehensive approach to that. We fully agree with the need to move to more risk-based due diligence. So then the question is, what is the role of assurance schemes in due diligence approaches? Let me start by saying that assurance schemes and audits are not equal to due diligence. It's not the same. Assurance schemes can, at best, be one of the tools in a company's due diligence toolbox. The previous speakers also talked about this. This one tool can never be the sole and the exclusive resource for any company doing due diligence. It's not fit, basically, for the purpose of human rights and environmental due diligence. But if done well, I think assurance scheme can support in identifying non-compliances and risks in the different levels of the supply chain. Now, very important, and the previous speakers also alluded to that, one key success factor there is whether or not meaningful stakeholder engagement is integrated in these approaches. So are the small-scale miners, are they being consulted and making a contribution to the implementation of these assurance schemes? Are their concerns and their challenges not only being heard, but also being addressed? That is a key success factor in my opinion. So I want to close off with 3 key takeaways. Like I said, we really need to go beyond compliance and beyond assurance schemes and shift from top-down audits to more risk-based due diligence approaches. And let's keep the ultimate goal front and center. The goal is to make an actual positive impact for rights holders, for ASM miners, local communities, etc. So let's ask the question, what is the impact that these schemes are delivering for rights holders, and what are their concerns? How is the assurance scheme addressing these concerns? And last but not least, involve them in these processes, in audits, but also in governance of these schemes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Baukje, for your input. And last but not least, we can look at the energy transition together with Michael Congdon. Very warm welcome to our webinar. The floor is yours.
From my side, I'd like to welcome you also to the event that we're doing today. In my case, it's a bit of a different approach. It's a business approach, namely, how did we get to this collaborative approach in human rights in the supply chains? And I think it's a good example of where you can start before you get into the topic of assurance schemes. So here it's predominantly about the bauxite mining in Guinea and the respective connection that it has to the sector energy dialogue in Germany. That's the first space. I'm personally from Integra. It's here on the next slide. It's a national energy provider in Germany. The basically focused region is in the south of Hesse, which is near the Rhine, Main, and Neckar rivers that all come together in that region. And you see here to the left, basically a small indication of the region where we predominantly are active, but also, if we look further at the key product segments for the energy transition, one being wind power, the second being solar, the third being the distribution grid, and then additional ones such as battery storage, hydrogen, natural gas, and district heating. Those are basically the focus products of the future, or somewhat today, that will be part of the analysis today. Things like coal and other things we left out because there are other initiatives that take care of those issues. So what happened to Integra was we started with the KSG, with this Supply Chain Act in Germany. And we decided to focus on two different issues that will be apparent on the next couple of slides. One was the construction and operation of energy infrastructure, and the other was looking at raw materials in the deeper supply chain. What did we notice? One was that with the construction operation of energy infrastructure, we have the possibility of a stronger influence because a lot of the companies that we use through procurement, they're smaller and regional suppliers. So they're more dependent upon Integra as a major business. And the second half, we noticed that the raw materials in the deeper supply chain, there were a lot of transparency issues, but there was also the thing about having international and national suppliers where we have a lot less influence based on our size. What we found is that there were 11 other businesses, 12 in total, that were also interested in these issues. And we got together to discuss the problem of influence that we all individually had, basically very little. The second issue that we discussed, which I addressed on the last slide, was the topic about sub-suppliers in the supply chains. How do you establish a form of transparency to know where are you involved and where should you make a difference? So all of us had this same dilemma of trying to deal with both of these issues individually. And because that wasn't successful, we all supported a multi-stakeholder approach in the form of collaboration. What was important here? Well, these businesses that got together to discuss the issue addressed it with BMAS and GIZ in Berlin, and were allowed to start the next energy, or to start an energy sector dialogue, including our business associations, but also unions, NGOs, and civil society are also represented. Like I said, the politics or the government. And then what's slowly coming is also a basis for suppliers and sub-suppliers. So what did we look at? We looked at this topic of how do we increase our leverage in the supply chains in which we act, and also how do we increase the transparency, which was very helpful in this common context, not only with the businesses, but also with the other partners that show us things that we'd never looked at before. So what we did in the initial phase was to establish a risk catalog, I would call it, with the key products of the segment, like I addressed before, the same things that Integra was interested in: wind, solar, distribution grids, battery storage, hydrogen, natural gas. Why natural gas? Because it's basically the bridge. People talk about it as being the bridge to the renewable economy. And the two issues that I addressed in the very beginning, the construction and operation of energy infrastructure, were also common to the businesses in this sector dialogue, and also the topic of various raw materials that they were not able to make transparent in their supply chains. So addressing these issues was very important. And how do we get to bauxite mining in Guinea? Well, you see here a small line indicating some sort of import routes. And what we established is that at least three, if not more, of the main product segments that we're involved in have a very high reliancy on aluminum components. So what would be intelligent is to look into the supply chain and find out, where does bauxite ore come from for a lot of the products that go into the German energy transition. We found that 80 to 90% of the imports from Germany of bauxite come from Guinea, so it was quite obvious that we could make a difference if we get involved here. What were the issues in the deeper supply chain? Well, if you go into the region of Guinea, you notice that this was a really intensive strip mining, so it's very land intensive and removes people from basically vegetated regions and maybe into less arable things for agriculture. So here we noticed that agriculture was hindered. You see the landscape. We also noted there's a massive dust formation, which has not only problems with agriculture, but also with health issues and many other things, and also adds to this problem in the waterways of the runoff that basically can clog the streams or destroy fishing prospects for the people that live in the region. What we tried to do is not only take our sector dialogue, but also make contact through the official sites of the German government to the government and the ministries in Guinea, also to local communities and NGOs. That was a very nice tie to the civil society that we have involved. There were other initiatives that were involved there, and also the mining operators, which are very important. Here down below, you see two other possibilities. We're trying to do a multi-sector approach where we get common projects and ideas together with automobile and also with transportation. So getting all these partners together on one table to discuss the issues and find out what would be good issues for the future, we noticed that the automobile dialogue had already established for the waterways a project that was important to figure out how to rehabilitate these possibly destroyed regions. And then on the other side, we as the energy sector decided with the same partner to make it more operable for the mine operators to pursue a land rehabilitation project. Was still in the initial phase of project realization. So we haven't started with implementation. There are a lot of discussions to be involved to just try to see what the common issues are on this side with this side, but the initial idea is out there. So why do I mention this? Because this collaborative approach we find to be much more efficient and effective for all the partners involved, so that it's not a lot of conflicting projects at the same time, so on, or mainly just projects for a productive development in the region. If we go a step further and try to figure out when these things are implemented, what would be a good way to audit the results of this process? We did also have a study done that looked into land rehabilitation as a prospect from the sense of the Aluminum Stewardship Initiative. That was one of the assessment schemes or assurance schemes that we looked at, and the second was IMA. And the two of these were very helpful because we as a business community with these other partners could go together, like I said before, the collaborative approach to make everything more efficient, more effective, and if issues can be addressed, to solve them much more quickly if they weren't addressed in the initial implementation. So why did we choose these two? Well, we have two different criteria that were involved. The selection criteria for ASI, or Aluminum Stewardship Initiative, was tied to the specifics of aluminum. It's called the Aluminum Stewardship Initiative, and the core raw material bauxite. It also has a high market coverage in this sector. And another important aspect was the chain of custody approach, which went further than just the mining and into the processing aspect. And the second we looked at, like I said, was the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, or IRMA. The selection criteria here were a bit different. It was a well-renowned practice, so that was a good indicator that it's at least known in the industry. The other was the multi-stakeholder approach, which we find very important, not only to address the issues from a business side or maybe only a union side, but to get the different parties involved, especially the people in the local communities, and the applicability to other various raw materials. So if we establish this in one raw material base in our deeper supply chain, maybe when we go to the second and third, it will be helpful as well. And the last slide that I have is just to address a few possible shortcomings, not necessarily only from these assurance schemes, but in general. We had some of them discussed before in the other issues that you saw today, but possible shortcomings are the limited details in the audit reports. Sometimes you don't get the entire report, just little summaries from that, and it makes it difficult to discern if there's something that would be applicable to your issues. The second was little information on corrective action plans, which are very important for all parties involved and parties influenced by the measures. The third was the effectiveness of ESG measures, that not necessarily being clearly assessed. That was difficult to interpret, or can be difficult to interpret in such schemes. The legacy issues, if they were within the scope of an issue or not, that means that issues that happened maybe years before that don't seem to be relevant today, but for the people that were basically moved from particular regions or hindered in the past, it's an important issue for them. The potential for prior feedback from the rights holders, but not only prior feedback, in the end also to find out what's developed in these schemes, what are the things that can be done for the future. And then here we see the mechanism for independent advice for the rights holders, which can be very important because there's also a power disadvantage here that we talked about today, and how extensive can it be and still be manageable. That's also very important. So what we figured out is that most of these assurance schemes, no matter what they're called, there's always room for improvement, the typical plan, do, check, act. So keep that in mind. It's never an ending story. It's more an iterative process in which you learn. So thank you very, very much for your time and attention, and I hope that was helpful for your thoughts.
If you are interested in discovering more, please feel free to visit the European one-stop shop for due diligence in mineral supply chains and explore our knowledge base. This knowledge base includes a series of in-depth articles covering all important aspects of responsible business conduct, as well as recordings of previous webinars. More than 100 digital tools related to sustainability due diligence in mineral supply chains, featuring informative descriptions and test reports. And about 100 regulations and standards related to due diligence, clearly presented and explained. Find out more on our website, diligence.eu. Thank you to all speakers again for taking the time and sharing your insights. We look forward to seeing you again at one of the next Diligence webinars early next year.